Okay, welcome everyone to the Militarized Equipment Ad Hoc. It is February 6th, 2023. It is 6:04 p.m. We have a much smaller group with us today. Hopefully that, nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we're going to not talk about it as much as we did before, we just have a smaller group today. For today's purposes, what I think what makes the most sense based on the timing is that I was hoping that we would go through Council Member Ramachandran's proposed changes, which I believe I emailed to everyone, and I'll have them up on the screen in a second. Those are specifically to chemical agents as well as the specialty impact munitions policy. We started talking about that at our last meeting. And then if we have time, then we will also go through the impact report for explosive breaching, a policy that we have been working on, the department has been working on, and has a final copy for us to review and go through. Anything else that we should go through, or any other topics to bring up?
Nope, I think that covers it.
I think I will say that I think at the next meeting, which is likely going to be on the 20th, first we talk about whether or not to have it because it's a holiday, and then the second is we are coming up on the annual report for the militarized equipment. I think the commission has a choice of whether or not to have the report or to exercise an option to delay it or schedule it for another time of the year. I think that we on the ad hoc should either make a recommendation soon if we are going to, or if I think the department should probably consider whether or not they want to just have the reports coming up in March, or to request to approve or request to delay it. And if so, I have a feeling that it's going to come through this ad hoc or should come through this ad hoc first. So can I flag that for members of the department to come back at our next meeting?
Absolutely. I'll talk with Lieutenant Febel about it and see if it seems like March is doable for a report.
Excellent. Okay. I think that's it. So shall we get started? Is that okay with everyone? Okay. So what I will do is first I will put on the screen the suggested amendments by Councilperson Ramachandran so that we all have it. I will make it a little bit more readable. That did not help with the readability. Page. Okay, there we go. All right. So they specifically relate to the chemical agents policy and the specialty impact munitions. One of the things for both of these policies recommend adding some language that is likely very familiar, language that we had in the patrol rifle policy, which is this language, which I'm highlighting right now. Commanders shall make every effort to avoid deployment of chemical agents here, specialty impact munitions later on that you'll see, in the presence of minors, the elderly, medically compromised people, people with physical, mental, or intellectual disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, or other vulnerable people, and a reference back to DGO K3. We did have a significant amount of discussion about this in patrol rifles, and we started to have that conversation for specialty impact munitions. I hope to continue that discussion to see if this language makes sense in the context of the policies that are there, or it should be adjusted. The second change relates just to chemical agents, and it's to include the specific language of Penal Code Section 13652 relating to limiting the use of chemical agents during crowd control situations. And it's this highlighted portion here. Just putting into the document what the law specifically is. And then the third is incorporating language that we saw in the patrol rifles policy, which is incorporating a section into prohibited use in tactical operations, because it's specifically the tactical operation section. All uses that are not authorized by this policy are prohibited, and specifically prohibiting recruitment, public relations, promotional activities, crowd control, and routine patrol operations. And then this is, of course, the recommendation for SIM, limiting the use. So if I can, I think I will stop there. And then hopefully turn to our SIM policy, where we did talk about this, or had been talking about this at our last meeting. It's here. Okay. And I've brought up for us all the section specifically that we're talking about. It's deployment considerations for SIM. And we are talking about, oops, sorry. Adding a section. It could be anywhere that I have down in red below. Just as a bit of an overview, I'm sure you all already know this, but so that it's clear, we already do have a section that talks about special conditions before using SIM, specifically for people who are pregnant, preteen children or elderly people, and people who are physically disabled. This adds another qualitative statement that would probably get defined into some sort of policy or training to avoid the deployment of SIM in the presence of minors, elderly, medically compromised people, people with physical, mental, or intellectual disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, or other vulnerable people. I will also note that, as we were discussing before, the next section does talk about certain factors for a member to consider absent or exigent circumstances. And ones that are likely related to this amendment are these sets of consideration, which talks about language barriers, under the influence of any medication, illegal drugs, or intoxicant, whether the engaged person has any mental or psychological impairment, and what is the age of the engaged person, and does their age factor into the level of assistance. So I'll first turn to the department as to their view about how this amendment might fit in, thoughts about it, whether it should be tweaked, not put in as it is, etc.
Yeah, I think looking at the statement, it's pretty good. I'm just, what did we put for K6? I know it was really similar.
I'm happy.
I'm
to
just
bring
kind of
that
like that's, I like to keep it similar to the other policies, if that's all right with everybody else.
Of course. Just give me 1 sec. I can bring that up for us. K6 is on the right, TB3H is on the left. Lieutenant Toribio.
Thanks. Excuse me. Still kind of trying to get over this. I think I sound a lot better than I do last time. So I think that on the page on the left where it has the proposed amendment there in red, I believe the sections above do a good job of basically explaining that, hey, look, we don't want to use these munitions when certain individuals meeting certain criteria are present, unless, and the gist of it is saying, the use of it is going to outweigh, or the potential harm or effects of using these tools don't outweigh the need to use them, right? So like, it's essentially saying that we need to consider it. We don't want to use it against these vulnerable populations, but the benefits of deploying it outweigh the risks or the damage that they could potentially cause. So in turn, I think that the amendment as written does a similar thing to what we were talking about with K6, where it kind of handcuffs or freezes, causes kind of like that chilling effect, where now, like, we can't use it because just because of the verbiage on how it's listed. So I think using language similar to K6, it just kind of reinforces what's said in the above points for pregnant people and preteen children and elderly people physically disabled. Now, if some categories need to be expanded and we need to include other folks, or we just maybe include a blanket statement on vulnerable populations footnoting where that can be found, I think that could best incorporate the spirit of what I think this amendment is trying to put forth.
And I also think too that Lieutenant Turbio brings up a good point. It's very similar verbiage to J4 as well, our pursuit policy, just in the fact that obviously pursuits are very high risk, and the policy clearly states that the continuance, or in this case would be use, has to be governed by the community footprint versus the use of the item. And I think that what Steve was talking about, it is critical for clarity for anybody who might deploy a rifle.
So let me ask, in the event that we have language like this, what makes the most sense? Should we just take what we have in K6 and then plug it in? Or should we lay out other factors like we have in A through C in 1? It's a small group. Just go right ahead.
Thanks. If I may, I think that if because we came to a consensus on the verbiage for K6. That was the last one, I think, where we referenced a similar or address a similar need or a similar topic. I think if we kept it consistent, that would be best, because then now, like, it's similar verbiage across the policies, and it leads to a more kind of linear understanding of what that's pushing forward. I do like what it says about, in A, B, and C, and how it just is explicitly stating, like, hey, the benefit has to outweigh the potential risk. But I also think it's covered in the language of what's in case 6. So I'm personally more inclined to go for brevity, but obviously I don't want to sacrifice the intended message that's this amendment is trying to push forth.
Mr. Lindsay Pollard.
Yeah, I don't. It's already what a 23-page policy or something like that. So adding a paragraph or 2 sentences doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. And I think the A through C are good, and this would add, if you adopted the language from K6, it would add some additional clarity. It would expand the populations who are being protected by these particular considerations. It would also include the need to ascertain whether those vulnerable populations are present, which I think was a good addition to K6. while, we would like something that is as strong as possible. So, the reasonable efforts thing is not, we're not crazy about, but we understand the point. If the committee were of a mind to adopt the language in K6 and add it as you have here, I think it would be stronger.
So I'm going to note one problem, which is with just creating a longer list of A through C based on the populations that are listed in this amendment, which is that the amendment seems to get at specifically deployment as opposed to use, right? And deploying in the presence of. And we talked a little bit about this, or tried to get a little bit at this, which is when we're talking about specialty impact munitions, we're really talking about SIMs loaded into shotguns, and then SIMs loaded into the 40 millimeter launcher. And so it seems to me that this amendment would mainly talk about deployment in the presence of, as opposed to actually using. Does that make people feel differently about their positions?
For me, no, because I think that the considerations fall in either case, whether it's just the visible presence of these things or the actual use. They should be the deployment or presence of these munitions, or the actual use of these munitions in the presence of or on vulnerable populations. The consideration to me should be the same. I think they both hold weight. And I don't know if Jeff or Febel or Cardona have a differing opinion, but I think I don't foresee, the department having any issue with having those considerations for either a deployment or actual use.
For me, for the panel, I agree with Steve.
And I would note.
No, go ahead, John.
I would also note that at least in AB 481, the word use really refers to deployment. It's not referring to use of force, which is not referenced at all in AB 481. So I think use is, in the context of AB 481, generally does mean deployment.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I do like it going in front, like Jesse's doing. Have it number one, and then number two will be a little bit more, go into details. So I think it reads fine.
And the reason why I bring that up is not just for the ordering, or not to quibble about whether or not deployment is covered by AB 481, but mainly to see if it makes sense as this separate section as one, rather than trying to plug it into two, right? And the other considerations. I think we're pretty I think we have a consensus. I just want to make sure.
With my eyes, I think it looks fine. I feel okay about it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I'm good.
I don't think this is the I feel like this is not the final version, but this is where we'll plug it in, and then I'll figure out the final version to make a clean copy of this for City Council. Any other thoughts on this particular piece? Just we're talking about specialty impact. Vice Chair?
No, I'm happy with the sort of the spirit of where we're going with this. I'm sure it'll get sort of smoothed out language-wise, but I mean, it's rare that we've come to consensus so quickly on anything. I'm not trying to mess it up.
I'm reading council members Ramachandran's language, who says, I believe the language shall make every effort to avoid, and this is not in the first paragraph, but in the second paragraph, is important to quell concerns about the occasional need in exigent circumstances to deploy these agents, as it does not limit in such situations. I'm wondering if the department can talk about whether the shall make reasonable efforts is a, I mean, yeah, you were talking about not being locked in, but is this a something that would say that in exigent circumstances is the implication that in however exigent circumstances are going to be defined, that even in the presence of some of these folks, that the commander would not need to avoid deployment?
Yeah, I think so, sir. I think that as I'm reading the verbiage, it does not read that, you know, you shall avoid in the presence of certain vulnerable populations. I think it's okay by my eyes, anyways.
But what I'm asking is this something that speaks to exigent circumstances? And I ask that because the council member specifically said, I would like this to cover exigent circumstances. And so just want to note that if this is a window for use in exigent circumstances, it is specifically contrary to what the council member was seeking.
That's how I read it. I read it as, you know, we don't want to use SIM on certain populations, and that needs to be a consideration. And again, I don't know if it's just me being in my position and how I read policies, but I'm reading it as there has to be some extenuating circumstances in order for this to be done. And that's what I'm inferring from the language.
Let me ask it this way. I think maybe where CM Ramachandran is thinking is perhaps we want these considerations to be made even in situations involving exigent circumstances, which legally is destruction of evidence, some sort of life-threatening situation, and I always forget the third one, fleeing. The person who's fleeing, I can't remember.
Yeah, fleeing is defined as an element of exigency.
Right. And so I suppose the question is, you know, even in these three situations, would you still be thinking about the things that this policy is asking you to think about?
I read it as yes, that we do. And I believe, not speaking for Toribio, who's going to probably do most of this training, but it's another checkbox for the officers to think about prior to, you know, deploying these type of weapons out in the field.
Yes, exactly. I think by virtue of it being a point here in the policy period, and in the whole of what that section is saying, I agree with Thompson. It's I don't think it's something that is just seen as like an out. I think it's, look, in any circumstance, exigent, not exigent, like this has to be a consideration in your deployment. and the risk of the effects of deploying SIM cannot outweigh the benefit of deploying it and the potential consequences. It just can't outweigh it. So yeah, I agree with Thomas in here.
And to call out the specific situation that council member is mentioning, active school shooter, OPD shows up on scene, considers whether or not to use specialty impact munitions. Are you still considering the presence of young children, elderly people, people with physical, mental, or intellectual disabilities with this language that's in the policy?
Yes, I mean, outright, I can probably say, you know what, like this is going to look really bad, and maybe it's a quick decision, right? Like I understand this is going to look bad when I'm pulling out this 40mm launcher, which is much bigger than my handgun, which perhaps people are just accustomed to seeing on the hip of an officer. So maybe that's a low level of either fear or just uneasiness that the presence of a weapon provides. But in the context of people's lives being immediately lost, that's a quick decision. It's like, God, I understand this looks bad. Just inherently, this is a bad situation. But the driving factor here is stopping the immediate loss of life, and that's just a quick decision that's got to be made.
Any other thoughts on the specialty impact munitions policy?
Yes, there was a section that just this section, sir, or the whole of what you covered. I think there was a section that referenced law and had the recommendation was to copy and paste elements of law.
That'll be chemical agents.
Okay,
Not quite there.
Sorry,
don't worry, we're almost there. Hearing none on specialty impact. We don't have legal counsel here. Okay. I will get this forwarded to commission. I think it's probably going to show up on the 23rd for all of your timing purposes. Oh, that reminds me. The other 3 policies from our last few meetings are going to show up tomorrow, February 7th, at the City Council. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen and let's go to so I do have a Word version of chemical agents. I have redacted it so that the things that were redacted are still redacted. And so I'm about to put it up as soon as I figure out where I need to go. As soon as my Microsoft Word stops freaking out. Sorry, I had to restart it. Let me just make sure it is still redacted. Yep, okay. All right. So the first section is,
Could you make it a little larger?
I'll see what I can do. For you, sir, absolutely. Okay. All right. And so we are going to be going over section the first of the proposed amendments, which is section 2B4 and unauthorized uses. We'll get to that. Okay, so 2B4 is duty aerosol. We're talking about issued to members of the department. So one of their non-lethal options. We're talking about the first section is description, the second section is operation, and then the operation section talks about primary targets, secondary targets. It talks about considerations for deployment, and then the avoiding of the use of OC on the following persons unless there is imminent threat of injury to the officer, third party, or the person. Elderly, reasonably known to be mentally disturbed, known or reasonably believed to be suffering from obvious respiratory disabilities, person known or reasonably known to be pregnant, young children, and a handcuffed person. So this proposed amendment is, I guess, adding an additional section here as best as I can do it. This section. I guess my first question is for the duty aerosol. Is there anything beside what does it look like, and are there different types?
The aerosol that is distributed now, oh gosh, I don't know how to. It's just a couple inches, a few inches tall, and if I'm not mistaken, they stopped several years ago now issuing different sizes, and everybody gets just the smaller container. If you give me a second, I'll try to look it up, and then I can post a link to the chat here, and then people can see. But it's just one type. Chris, I don't think that the TAC team is currently being issued anything different, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I think the one you're looking for is probably like the MK6 or something like that. It might actually be on this as one of the listed on there.
Yeah.
MK6, MK4. And those are the two different sizes. MK6 is probably, I think, right now what we're authorizing, not authorizing, but are distributing to officers to use. And it's the smaller version of it. We do have other ones, but it's OC, it's just in a different, but this is for the TAC team. This is not for duty use. Or for like patrol officers and stuff like that.
That's correct. The team is equipped with different carriers, I guess, for lack of a better word, but for duty issued, everyone's issued the same thing. And forgive my ignorance with Zoom, but when I go to the Q&A section and then post the link there?
No. Did you just Google it? And did you just Google the First Defense MK6?
Yeah, it should be. It should take you to the Defense Technology website, and it's the MK6 Stream OC aerosol.
Well, the first option was Amazon, which is a little horrifying, but all right, let's see if I can get this up.
So I typed in MK-6 space OC. There you go. So
This one. Okay. And is the MK4 smaller or bigger?
The 4 is the larger. If I'm
It's just a taller version of it. It's I remember when I first started, we got issued two different types. One's just smaller and one's larger. That's it.
correct. Yeah, but it's the same concentration, same irritant. It may have a different propellant just because of the container, but in effect, it's the same agent.
And do you know what the concentration is? Because the concentration makes a difference now.
I think it's 1.3%, but I'd have to check and see if the actual bulletin lists it.
Now that we know what we're working with, I guess that puts into context the proposed amendment. Oops, sorry. I should be.
All right.
Sure.
I actually just pulled the item from my duty belt, and it is 0.2%. It's 0.2%.
Okay, so thoughts on this particular amendment?
I'm inclined to again go for consistency in verbiage, just for the reasons I stated prior. Going consistent verbiage, I think, is just the best course here.
Yeah, I think that both for consistency's sake and this language in these amendments sort of consistently has the same issue that we had with it previously, which is just it is not quite as specific, and can be sort of fallible on either side of either it's not being properly forced because it's not specific enough, or it's too broad and hamstrings officers in when they need to use it. So I agree we should go with something as close to K6 as possible, unless we feel like there's something more specific about chemical agents that would differentiate it in some way.
So that's why I brought up or want to focus on specifically the duty aerosol, right? Since it's about this particular section, and I wonder if we have those same considerations that we would for a 40mm launcher, a patrol rifle. Yeah.
I think the same. I don't see an issue, and obviously I'm still turning it in my head, but with applying kind of the same sensitivity to deployment when it comes to vulnerable populations. As I'm thinking now, I don't have an issue with it, but I can still spin in my head, and I don't know if Chris, Bill, or Jeff have any thoughts on that outright, but I don't have an issue with it.
No issues here.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with the similar language being put in there. The only thing I was thinking of, there's a couple different ones, right? Pregnant people and stuff, or handcuff person. I'd like to keep in the policy.
Right. And so again, it's the sort of thing where there's a question in the chat, which is, are we keeping number 4 and just adding 5, not replacing number 4? It feels like, again, this is one of those, we're talking about a little bit of a broader consideration about the deployment and sort of paying attention to who is around. And then there is a more specific consideration that officers shall attempt to avoid the use of OC on the following persons. Are we keeping that framework like we did for the last one?
Yeah, I'm fine with that, making the commanders one number 4 and then moving the other one down to 5. So we have that broader for the commanders, and then the officers get the more strict language.
And there would still be the language of attempting to ascertain the presence.
I would be plugging in. Hopefully without destroying this entire document. I'm just going to type. Trying to format in Word. Always so much fun. I'll figure it out later. Okay.
And don't forget to replace patrol rifles with.
Good catch. Thank you. Do I put duty aerosol or OC? OC?
I'm sorry. Let's see.
OC is fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Now I guess I suppose just to make sure that we catch everything. Is there anything that we should change about the list that we have now? Adding to it, subtracting, making more clear.
Is there a definition? Yeah, somewhere of mentally disturbed. Yeah, I think, people more frequently these days talk about people in a mental health crisis or with a mental disability, but mentally disturbed could be ambiguous. I don't know. Maybe there's a definition somewhere.
I can look for one, but I don't know if there's one offhand.
Yeah, that sounds, I mean, I put on my sort of, social worker guy hat and say that mentally disturbed feels very stigmatizing, and we should probably use something a little more neutral. Thank you for catching that, John.
What is the language used while training? Do I want to know?
I'm not sure. What was. I think I would attribute what's highlighted there as someone who is being like equivalent to somebody being evaluated under 5150 W&I. Someone who's potentially a danger to themselves or others, or gravely disabled as a result of a mental health condition or emergency or some type of substance or alcohol.
Does mental health crisis or a person experiencing a mental health crisis adequately cover the consideration here? Is it too broad, too narrow? What are your thoughts?
I think that there's it's probably not broad enough, because you might have someone who's in a crisis, and this is really going to make things worse. But you might also have someone who has a mental or emotional disability and is not understanding or communicating or hearing things in the same way that other people might. And they might not be in a crisis. They might not be in a psychotic state, but they might have a disability mental or emotional disability that makes OC a blunt and brutal language. So
I'd add just something for me. I hear that, and I also think the opposite is true. Where there may be folks who are don't have a disability or sort of any sort of ongoing condition, but are just distraught, and that is a thing that happens where folks who are just they are distraught because of their whatever it is that has brought them into contact with the police. Sometimes it's it's something that is they are not always. Sometimes they are the victim of a crime, or there's a lot of variability there. I would say mental and emotional crisis probably covers the gamut there. It is pretty broad, but I also think that if you're upset to the period where you cannot take direction from an officer, that I think that rises to the level of crisis. And also I hear what you're saying about it being sort of a sort of standard state and not a crisis state, or just sort of maybe mental emotional crisis or otherwise decompensated, something along those lines.
Lieutenant Toribio, when you train on this, what is it that you're asking officers to look for to determine whether someone should not falls under this category B?
I think traditionally it's been kind of what I mentioned, somebody more in line within an emergency, somebody who's a danger to themselves or others, where kind of alternative means need to be considered, right? So you talk to somebody who's having a mental health crisis or a mental health emergency different than you would if they were like a robbery suspect, for example, right? They're just going to interpret things differently. So that's kind of how I saw it. In terms of the language here, I think they're two different things under this subsection of attempting to avoid the use of OC unless there's imminent threat to injury, etc. Somebody who has a condition, for example, I don't know if that's the intended population for this specific subsection. So somebody suffers from Pickett, bipolar, depression, schizophrenia, because they're maybe diagnosed with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're in a mental capacity that's not going to understand what's going on, or where that consideration has to come into effect for use of OC, right? So I think it's a consideration, but I think what is more in line with what's most appropriate for this section is when somebody is in a state where, we're not going to get the desired outcome because of their inability to process that the effect of the OC is going to need to be compliant. So they may not be able to process that this pain that I'm registering. Okay, you know what? I need to stop doing what I'm doing. So I think it more needs to be focused towards addressing the audience or the population of people who are in more of an emergency than someone who is diagnosed but not in a crisis.
I'm a little concerned that the 5150 standard is too high bar. Because it's to be 5150 requires a lot. It's a significant threat to self or others. And I say this also because I've been reading data lately of another context, which is state prisons, where OC is used hundreds of times every month. So the situation that David talked about of someone is upset. They might be upset, right, because they were robbed, or they, like David said, because they're a victim. They might be upset with the police themselves, right? In that situation, they are not mentally ill. They are not in a psychotic state, but using OC is very likely an escalation. And so that concerns me, because they don't rise to a 5150. And so, okay, you know, and they're upset. And I just don't think it's a good quote tool to deal with people who are just upset, and they might be very with good foundation, they might be upset.
I understand the sentiment. I think I disagree though, because somebody who is upset, I think you can still get compliance through using objective reasonable force, be it OC or some other sort of pain compliance. So, you know, somebody who doesn't want to go to jail or disagrees with what it is I'm doing, they want to fight, any combative person, I think it's safe to qualify that person as upset. So to categorically exclude OC from being used on somebody who's upset, I mean, I'm trying to think of any instance where somebody would be combative and not be upset. So that would just automatically qualify that or disqualify use of this force, which I don't think is what we want.
Doesn't it depend on what you're trying to make happen? I mean,
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Doesn't it depend on what you're trying to make happen and how important that is?
Yeah,
Like,
of course. The use of any force, it's going to be to change behavior. It's to gain compliance. Perfect world, I give commands for detention for somebody that needs to be detained, and they follow it. When things don't go to plan and there's non-compliance, and then it starts to get more severe to where now there's harm or potential harm happening, we need to do something that changes that behavior. And essentially that's what force is being used for. And I don't think you'll find anybody in our profession who says that you know, we don't mean to hurt anybody. But make no mistake, if I'm using a sim, my intention is to hurt them. It's to cause pain. If I'm spraying somebody with OC, by it being something hot pepper, I intend to cause pain on this person, you know? So that's what these intermediate force options are. They're pain compliance.
But in the top of this section, there is already an exception for imminent threat of injury. What the bar that you just described of harm or potential harm, that's, to me, that's the much more significant bar. So, you know, but if that doesn't exist, if there's not an imminent threat of injury, then someone who is, as you say, combative, it could just escalate the situation.
I think where maybe we're not seeing things similarly is if somebody is combative, I see that as a threat. You know, somebody raises their fists and is advancing towards me. That's combative. And you know, I'm not gonna, you know, and we don't train, we don't advocate in any instance like this where we wait to be under physical attack before we respond. That's contrary.
So since you already have that carve out in the language above, why not make the language below to which that exception applies broader?
I think that at least I have maybe lost sight of the argument here. Specifically, what is the verbiage that we're looking to implement here?
All right, so let's reframe, not reframe, but let's back up for a little bit. OC spray is an intermediate use of force. It's subject to DGO K3. Obviously, then it has very specific requirements that must be met prior to the use of OC spray. This particular section creates an additional layer which says for the following people, for the following populations, OC spray cannot be used unless there is an imminent threat of injury to officer, third party, or the person.
I
So-
think for
It
the
doesn't
sake,
say cannot use, it says shall attempt to vote.
I think for the
Shots
sake,
of the
I think for the sake of the meeting and a lot of what Steve is probably trying to come across is that when we are dealing with these particular subjects and they are non-compliant, force is going to be used. It's a matter of what force is going to be used. And the language for OC makes it a significantly less viable option than other options that are highly likely to cause more injury. So these are options, these are force options we have to use to get a person to become compliant through the use of pain. And I think what needs to be highly considered in this verbiage is that OC is very easily nullified, removed. It does not cause long-term physical injuries, such as the use of a baton strike, potentially somebody falling from an ECW deployment, even a good physical takedown of a person onto a hard surface are all vastly more likely to cause injury to the party than a simple pepper spray. So when a policy like this is written like this, officers will use, according to the policy, other uses of force because force will be used. So when we write this down, we have to understand what direction we're complying with these force options out there because force will be used.
So what I understood in terms of the current policy and this piece B is that if someone is a threat to themselves or others in the standard of a 5150, then this provision of avoiding the use of OC unless there's a threat of injury would be applied. That's how the known or reasonably known to be mentally disturbed. That's how that's being interpreted. That's what I understand. Is that correct?
Could you maybe reframe that?
So Commissioner Shea was asking how you train with this, right? Because this is existing language. This is not proposed amendments. This is existing language.
Yeah.
So there's that phrase, a person or subject known or reasonably known to be mentally disturbed. And Commissioner Shea asked, when you train, what's the meaning of that phrase for you all? And I understood the response to be, okay, if the person is at the level of being able to be 5150, meets the criteria, then that's where this would kick in.
Yeah, that's how it's at least I've been interpreting it. And when we discuss this as a force option, that is the level to which we would scrutinize the deployment consideration factor at that level.
So would, if this said a person known or reasonably known to be in a mental health crisis, would that work for you all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an issue with that. I think it encompasses what we're valuing here about the deployment consideration and consistent with how we've been looking at it.
Does Vice Chair Jordan's suggestion of mental health or emotional crisis work for you?
One more time, sir, please.
Vice Chair mentioned mental health or emotional crisis. Does the addition of or emotional crisis change things for you, or still same?
I think it's the same. I think it's 6 in one, half a dozen in the other there. Obviously, I'd like the language to be as accurate and as the commissioner mentioned, not have like a negative connotation to it. So whatever that verbiage can be, obviously is what we want.
Got two options for you: known or reasonably believed, or known or reasonably known. Make a difference?
I don't see a real distinction. I think I'm fine with either.
And my third option, just to press the issue a little bit, is a person displays signs of experiencing a mental health or emotional crisis. I guess maybe that's a little bit harder.
I think I I think it conveys the spirit of what we're looking for. Does anybody else have any opinions on that? I don't think it. Sorry, go ahead.
You know, I was just thinking about it, and I know that there are sometimes for officers, they have knowledge of people who they see very often, and often know that someone may be experiencing a mental health or emotional crisis, even if they're not outwardly displaying it. So I suppose a reasonably known or reasonably believed might be better.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that happens when we're on scene. We're dealing with somebody, or at some place. Somebody, an officer will come up and say, "Hey, I've been to this place a bunch of times. I know this family XYZ, and I know they have a history of ABC 123 or so and so. He has been put on a hold before when he doesn't take medicine, and he can tend to behave in these ways." So. Yeah, that covers it very well, I believe. Thank you.
Any other thoughts about this list? I know I opened a can of worms, but as long as we're on the subject. Okay. Want to move on to the second suggestion, which was to add in the section about, section 3. Get the right language. Actually, no, I'm sorry. We still are on this. The amendment we were talking about avoiding the deployment in the presence of minors and vulnerable populations. It also suggests adding it into section 4A. 4A specifically talks about crowd control, chemical agents for crowd control. So we are now moving on to a crowd control situation. Okay. Authorized uses, prohibited uses. Yeah, I just need to figure out where exactly it's going to go. All right. I'm just trying to think, does it even go here? Or does it go in crowd control?
I think that section is in crowd control, isn't it?
Yeah, I think everything from 13.652 was added in 3G.
Sorry, that's not what I was talking about. I apologize. It's confusing. I'll just put it in. This is the amendment that Ramachandran was also seeking to put this language that we're talking about, every effort to avoid the deployment, into the crowd control section.
I'm fine with that in here because since crowd control already got approved,
Okay.
just to make it cleaner.
Not this language, though, the one from K6.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the section on, sorry, I'm catching up, about putting specifically language of 13652. I know it's in crowd control. And Councilmember Ramachandran notes that even though it does detail it, she believes it's important to highlight this, especially in light of policy referencing sideshows, since I think crowd control situations could talk about crowd control. I think that's, no, sorry, could talk about could be used in sideshow activity, sorry. I guess the first question is a legal point, which is, does 13652 apply to sideshows?
I think they're two different things. A crowd control, I would equate more to an unlawful assembly and riot, in which the deployment of chemical munitions are outlined in law there. Sideshow, I think, is a different circumstance. And it inherently is, from start to end, it's an illegal activity. Whereas for crowd control, it could be like a demonstration where people, and even like the majority of the people consistently throughout, are peacefully assembling. But then you have agitators, or you have something that turns into riotous behavior. I think they're apples and oranges. And I don't believe the deployment considerations should be completely equal across the board for a crowd control and for a sideshow situation.
And I'd like to double down on what Lieutenant Trivio is saying. Exactly. It's from start to finish. It's an intentional engagement on highly dangerous, unlawful activity, to include significant use of firearms. It's very uncommon these days to not have any firearm use at a sideshow. Secondarily, when we looked at our recent data for sideshows, a vast majority of those subjects that are engaging in sideshows are young adults, particularly male adults, and over 60% of folks who are engaged in sideshow activity were, South American, Latin culture, and stuff like that. And all of these things directly conflict with our ability to maintain safety and take quick decisions when dealing with this extraordinarily dangerous behavior.
What does 60% being Latin America have to do with anything?
So, I mean, when you talk about, making it more difficult for us to do engagement of use of force when it comes to possible, English proficiency or things of that nature, it makes it very difficult to justify use of force that needs to be immediately made necessary, when we know specifically in here that a majority of these folks, by statistics only, from what we've gathered from the department, may possibly fall into that category.
Mr. Lindsay Poland.
I find that rather startling. I think the department has some Spanish-speaking officers. If it doesn't have the capacity to give instructions in Spanish, I don't care whether it's a dangerous situation or like people are planting dandelions. You have to be able to communicate in the language of the people that you're interacting with. So I find that pretty startling. the restrictions within AB 48, within 13652, have to do with the indiscriminate nature of some of these weapons, particularly chemical agents, but not only chemical agents. That if you are going to deploy something, if you're going to shoot something on a group of people, if it's a big crowd of people, then it's built in that the impacts are going to be indiscriminate and are highly likely to include people who either are not violating the law or at the very least do not pose a risk to themselves or others. So, I find this kind of hard to swallow. AB 48 doesn't define crowd. It doesn't say that it's a First Amendment assembly or a protest. And it also doesn't say that it's a group of people who are doing donuts, in this intersection. So we're kind of left to interpret that. And, I think, but there is a need not to use weapons that have an indiscriminate impact in a crowd.
Yeah, I'm reading 13652 right now. It does say disperse any assembly, protest, or demonstration. I think that's how we read it here at the department. It's First Amendment rights. It's people that are going out there and they're protesting and they're assembling. For our department, we consider sideshows different. They are criminal activity that's taking place in our city. And do we go to a sideshow and just automatically start launching gas and disperse it? Absolutely not. There has to be certain factors that take place, and it's usually either gunfire, fireworks that are getting fired off at officers, gunfire in the crowd. They're not listening to our sirens or our direction to leave, and they're still continue to do the illegal activity. We consider that it's a crime that's taken place in our city. It's not that protected free speech that I think that the 13652 was really referring to.
But so you're saying that every single person there is committing a crime and is also a threat to others? Every single person there?
Not everyone, but we do give direction. We do come in with our sirens on. We do give people the opportunity to leave. It's when we do use this type of force, it's not, we try to target the individuals that are committing the crimes. Usually we're just launching smoke off to the side, not at anybody, to try to disperse this crowd. I know Trivia has been a lot more of those deployments than I have, but most of the time we're just trying to get the crowd to leave this certain area so then we can disperse the sideshow.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. Like Jeff was saying, spinning donuts does not necessitate or meet any practical threshold for deploying a chemical agent. And obviously not everybody there can be a participant. People get caught up. Obviously it'd be hyperbole to say that everybody in this area is involved. Now, it's likely a very high percentage, even spectators are considered in violation. They're preventing us from getting close to disperse the people in actual activity. But there may be instances where people who aren't involved actively are going to be present when we deploy. And one offhand that I can think of is when there was a shooting and there was a person down. Now that person is not involved in the sideshow at that immediate point, but we deployed in order to clear out the crowd that wasn't leaving despite our presence and sirens and announcements, so we can get to this person who had been shot.
In terms of sideshow enforcement, is it the tactical team that's responding or patrol?
We have a rotation, rotation in which every member, every officer is assigned to a team. And then we go through a rotation of teams that respond to sideshows. In conjunction with each of those teams, we have what's called a tango element that is made up of tactical team operators that are trained, obviously, in the deployment of chemical munitions, and only those tango teams are allowed to deploy under the direction of the commander.
And
So-
John, you do bring up a good point, sir. It's when this is delivered during the sideshow, it's delivered typically under exigent circumstances, very violent behavior where if somebody's shooting indiscriminately within the crowd, that behavior has to be immediately ceased, which was my point, is that we do not always have the luxury of being able to put out multiple warnings and notifications in different languages. These are really under, like what Steve and Thomason said, are under rare and unique circumstance that doesn't always afford us the opportunity to even provide a warning. When the shots get fired, we have to get that behavior to immediately cease. It's very tragic, the amount of homicides that have occurred during sideshows in recent years.
So 13652 does state very clearly that it would be authorized in crowd control if the use is objectively reasonable to defend against a threat to life or serious bodily injury to any individual, which seems to be describe exactly what you just described. I don't see why sideshows should be different from other types of assemblies in that respect. If a protest downtown had gunfire, you probably would respond in the same way. So I just don't see the separation of sideshows from other types of assemblies having any basis in, at least in this law.
So,
I see it
Vice Chair.
differently. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as you know, as stated earlier, there is a difference between this and a protest, in that, you know, the great majority of people who are engaging in, or at least a significant amount of people who are engaging in sideshows or you know, present at sideshows are committing a crime. And I don't know how many sideshows you've been caught in. It's not a great time if you're just trying to get where you're going. And I think that it is different in that there is, at a protest, there is very rarely that kind of deadly violence, whereas a sideshow, I think it is maybe appropriate to differentiate between a gathering that is inherently criminal versus a gathering that is inherently, you know, within our constitutional rights, and one that has, you know, pretty consistent amount of violence and gunfire versus you know, maybe some property damage. That to me is the major difference, and I think I'm comfortable with having a differentiation, meaning that there is the standard for that. I think the standard remains the same for deployment, but you know, one of them is a much more likely circumstance.
So you're saying, David, that the criteria would be the same in each situation?
That's what I was hearing from the department as well. That only under threat of violence would chemical agents be utilized, right? I feel like that's what I just heard. I think that there's just maybe a greater likelihood, and maybe a greater sense of sort of I don't know, wariness is too small a word for that, but you know, alertness to the danger.
what I will say is that we don't actually need to be the ones making the decision here. Clearly, reasonable minds can defer. But what we're asking for right now, and I guess it's my fault I opened up that question, is whether or not to put this specific language of 13652 into this policy under this particular section, which does talk specifically about crowd control. I would propose a footnote and referring to an appendix that is attached at the end of this policy rather than breaking up the flow of this policy. What are your thoughts on that, everyone?
I'm fine with that, as long as it's in conjunction with crowd control. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, the only other sections in this policy talk specifically about tactical
Mhm.
operations, and that's the section that does have a passing reference the site shows.
In terms of the language of 13652, again, I do agree with the footnote. I also think because law can sometimes change more than policy, if it may be beneficial to note that, you know, this is the current law, but there should be maybe something conditionally, like, you know, in reference to whatever the current law is regarding, you know, crowd control or something like that. That way, you know, law changes and now this by default becomes antiquated.
Sorry, everyone. I just want to let everyone know I unfortunately have to step out of the meeting. So I apologize, but thanks for everyone who was able to show up for the meeting tonight, and I will get the gist of it afterwards. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
I'm fine with adding a footnote and just saying, see the appendix. It's easy, I think, for us in the department and the police commission to change an appendix than a whole policy if things change. But
Right.
obviously, if things change we're going to be opening up the policy in the future anyways.
And so is there another section in here, Lieutenant Toribio, that you are concerned about outside of this footnote?
No, sir.
Okay. Interesting questions and interesting discussion. I'm sure time will tell. Okay. I will get that together. And then the last portion of this is incorporating a clarifying section into, yes, okay. Excuse me, we'll go down here. The red language here. So for context, and so we know where we're at, we are not talking about chemical agents for tactical operations. The first is introduction. The second part is authorized uses. Specifically of deployment by the tactical team members, or during operations, and then prohibited uses. The recommendation is we add this third section. Recognizing that this is specifically in tactical operations and or chemical agents that would be used in tactical operations or used by members of tactical operations or potentially even the Tango team. What are people's thoughts about this proposed amendment, section 3? Lieutenant Thomason, I see you.
Yeah, I'm fine with it, except for maybe the B section, crowd control. Maybe we put like in parentheses following training bulletin 3G.
We had this come up in was it in rifles?
Mm-hmm.
Where we had language shall not be deployed for purposes of crowd management, crowd control, or crowd dispersal. Nothing about a crowd control situation eliminates or changes any of the constraints of the force options in DGOK 3. Does that work? Try to stay consistent.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I think we know what it's supposed to mean. It's just I don't, and then we keep on saying this like 3 years from now, we might interpret it a different way, or someone might.
Right, okay. I hate the way this is worded, so sorry, I'm thinking about it. Okay, so just thinking about how this works. Chemical agents for tactical operations. We are talking about the duty aerosol. We're talking about something different that is not described later.
For tactical operations, I believe it would not, I don't think the language here is referring to the personal carry duty aerosol.
Okay. And then, so since we're not referring to that, we're talking about something that is different, bigger, scarier. What is it?
Chris, if you have more insight here, I know there are different vessels that are used. They have a larger container that can disperse more. They have a means of
Yeah, I see a
from-
37 millimeter and a 40 millimeter barricade penetrating projectile. I see,
With a CS in it.
yeah, I see the hand thrown. I see the expulsion grenade. I see the multi-purpose grenade and the instantaneous blast grenade, the chamberless flameless grenade. These are what we're talking about.
Yeah, I believe so. It's beyond, we're going beyond just the OC then in any type of like chemical munition delivery.
I would imagine then that these are options that are usually not used during routine patrol operations.
Correct.
Okay. And then likely or unlikely to be used in recruitment, public relations, or promotional activities.
I don't think they've ever been used in that capacity. I don't foresee that happening as well. And I don't think that the department has an issue with having that verbiage that precludes those things from being used for those purposes.
Okay. And then finally, what is the language in the section B to make sure that options are preserved that are currently stated in TB3, 3H? Because I assume that these are the options that are more likely to be used in crowd control situations.
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, I'm processing this, and I'm wondering if there's something that I'm not considering. Maybe I'd like to run it, by some folks. See if
So the current language says current chemical agents shall not be deployed for purposes of crowd management, crowd control, or crowd dispersal. That's pulled from the patrol rifle policy, but I don't think that's quite right, right? I think it's unless otherwise stated in TB3H or whatever the section is, 3G.
3G.
Am I right or wrong about that? Because I don't think they can't be used. They just are, it's very regulated in how they can be used.
No, I think that portion, sir, I think that portion right there is missing. Like you stated, it's not a prohibited all the way across. I think there's some stipulations that are covered in a different policy.
Right.
Can you bring up what's in 3G so we can see what that is?
Sure. Hey, look at that. I thought ahead. All right. All right, let's see, we are looking at this section.
So chemical agents shall not be used by any member to disperse any assembly, protest, or demonstration. That's pretty clear.
I think maybe where we're getting hung up is crowd dispersal. So obviously if they meet certain criteria, then if we're dispersing a crowd and it meets all that criteria, then we can use it.
Right.
So maybe just the purpose of crowd management and crowd control, and just take out crowd dispersal.
No, because the first line says shall not be used by any member to disperse, right? Unless maybe it's just chemical agents shall not be deployed unless, or
I think it might just be without the authorization of a commanding officer as a commander. I think that's where it differs.
okay, let's see. I think I just need to make a reference specifically to TB3G and say you can only use it in the way described by 3G.
That's good.
That should cover it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because we can't have the blanket statement shall not, because it's not a shall not. But I want a shall not accept. Okay. Accept as. Okay. Shall not be deployed except as provided in
And I think you said earlier that that 3G does incorporate the language of 13652.
it does, although it's a little bit more natural language and includes other things as well, I think. Do I still have it up? Qualified shall not be. There's the other alternatives. The force have failed. Repeated audible warnings to the crowd.
Yeah, that looks like language from subsection B of
Right.
6.2.
Given an objective and reasonable opportunity to disperse. Objective, reasonable effort to identify. Yeah, I remember going through this and looking for it. Only to use numbers, minimal amount. Necessary frequency, yep. Minimize potential, that's kinetic. Potential impact. Distract individuals in distress is probably up here. Yeah. Medical assistance, not aimed at. That's kinetic. Yep. Only a commanding officer may authorize tear gas. Yep. Yep. It's there. Okay. Okay, chemical agent shall not be deployed for purposes of crowd management, crowd control, or crowd dispersal, except as provided by TD3G. Okay. Just want to circle back to our discussion earlier. Does if we put in section B, does that prevent use of chemical agents during sideshows?
I don't consider it sideshows to be crowd management or crowd control situations.
Agreed.
Okay. It will probably be the exception rather than the rule when a sideshow may constitute that. But that's not going to be the subject of today's. Okay. Okay, I think that gets us through the amendments with some measure of consensus. Okay. Thank you all. These will probably show up for the commission meeting on the 23rd, which will probably mean that they will hit what does that mean they will hit? The 7th again, March 7th. That'll get us in within the deadline. And that'll be the last of this set. Great work, everyone.
Can we see if there's any public comment? There've been a few people hanging out.
There was one a little bit earlier when we were talking about stims. No, the beginning of chemical agents. Well, does anybody want to talk? Let's see. Any members of the public want to say anything about anything that they've seen tonight? Any of the policies or any of the amendments? Just raise your hands. While I'm waiting the 30 seconds for that, Lieutenant Feble, Sergeant Cardona, I will give you the option. Last 17 minutes to go over the impact report for explosive breaching or call it a night.
I think we've had an awesome discussion tonight, and I think we should conserve our energy for next evening, unless you have anybody opposed.
I don't think so. I think we've had plenty to chew on for the last 3 weeks or so. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised. I will get this all wrapped up with the remaining 16 minutes and sent to commission to pass along to city council. Thank you everyone for your time and your diligence. We'll plan art for our next meeting to be on the 20th. For explosive breaching, although I do recognize that that is a holiday. Does anyone have, it doesn't matter to me one way or the other. Does anybody have a strong objection to coming on the 20th, which would make our next meeting March 6th?
Hey, Jeff, off the top of your head, sir, is that an OPD holiday?
I can't remember. I don't think it is.
The only reason, Jesse, I ask is just because we're not technically authorized to work on holidays, some of us. Steve, do you know off the top of your head? How about Chris?
I see a hand up, so
No.
is it, we're city holidays, right? Department goes by city holidays. I could just look it up. No? How do I figure out if it's a holiday for you?
I'll ask the bay right now.
Okay.
While you get the hand.
And I will be out on the 20th. Jennifer might be here. I'm not sure.
Let's take this hand. ILM, allowed to talk. Please let us know your thoughts.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for all of your work. I just wanted to know if the draft that you're sending over to the Police Commission will be available for review, or when will it be available for review? I guess is the question.
I think that it will be available by the Friday before, which means that it will be on by February 17th.
Okay, thank you. I've been trying to take notes, but I missed some of tonight, so I wanted to try and keep up with that.
I'll see if I can get it uploaded
Oh,
before
okay,
then.
perfect.
To the website. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, it looks like the 20th is considered a holiday.
I do not want to be the person contributing to OPD overtime, so that would mean our next meeting will be March 6th.
Sounds right.
I'm sure I'm already contributing to a lot of OPD overtime, and I apologize.
Or do we want to go to 27th? Just move it up a little bit, or I do enjoy being with you guys all the time, and
That's
I
very
I
sweet.
would like to finish this project sometime
Very
this year.
sweet. Yes. Well,
I mean, I'm free all the time, so I mean, if you guys want to do the 27th, or we can do the 6th, it's up to you guys. I think it's just explosive breaching is the last thing.
right. Why don't I poll the other members of the ad hoc on the 27th?
Chris, are you available? You are our subject matter expert there. Very important.
It should be, sir. I don't see why not. Always working.
Yeah, 27th is good for me, if that
For
counts.
me too.
John,
Which one?
let me just check one place for what I'm checking to see is if, because we only have one Zoom account for the commission, if there's another webinar or meeting scheduled on the 27th. Nope, we're good. 27th. Let's do it. I don't think we'll get it in time for the annual report one way or the other, but 27th indeed. Okay, 27th. I'll let Kelly know and have the invite sent out. Thank you all for your time, your energy, and your thoughtfulness. We'll see you all on the 27th.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good holiday.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care.